The blue eyes, blonde hair myth claims that the Nazis planned to eliminate anyone without blonde hair and blue eyes. However, this idea was never part of policy and is wrong. The National Socialist movement was built on racial ideology. Hitler and thinkers like Alfred Rosenberg argued that the German people were losing their racial purity and needed to separate from others. Hitler's time in Vienna reinforced his belief that multicultural states were dysfunctional, pushing him toward the idea of a united German destiny. Rosenberg's theories placed Nordics, Aryans, Germans, Anglo-Saxons, Dutch and Flemish at the top of a racial hierarchy, an idea that influenced Hitler and resonated with many Germans. NS propaganda reflected this worldview. Posters and films highlighted ideal Germans with strong features, blonde hair and blue eyes, presenting men as heroic and women as motherly. Post-war media exaggerated this stereotype. This wasn't about excluding those without these traits, but about presenting symbols of racial uniqueness. The term Untermensch, or subhuman, was applied not to people without blonde hair, but to criminals, alcoholics and social parasites. This worldview was used to justify the National Socialist racial policies. The 1935 Nuremberg laws defined Aryan by ancestry, not appearance. Most states in the US had also enacted laws prohibiting interracial marriage by that time. The SS embodied this ideal more strictly than other organizations. Applicants needed Aryan ancestry back to 1800, had to be tall, healthy, without a criminal record, and were screened for Nordic features. Himmler even personally checked photographs. Standards were so high that only about 15% of applicants were accepted. And for Hitler's bodyguard unit, a single dental filling could be a reason for rejection. The SS's obsession with racial science was unique within the Nazi state, resembling the elite selectiveness of historical bodyguards like the Swiss Guard. Ultimately, hair and eye color had little impact on Nazi policy, especially considering that most Nazi leaders, including Hitler, did not fit the air quotes ideal. These traits made people useful for propaganda but offered no privilege or protection. The Aryan concept was vague and opportunistic, including many ethnic groups regardless of their hair or eye color. Hitler's One Testicle myth is one of the most persistent ones, popularized by the British wartime song "Hitler has only got one ball," but evidence for the story is weak. Alleged medical records from Hitler's prison exam in 1923 noted that he had one undescended testicle, not a missing one. This contradicts speculation that he lost a testicle to shrapnel at the Battle of the Somme or in a childhood accident involving a goat. In fact, his wartime injury at the Somme was to the thigh, not the groin. Accounts from his personal physicians Theodor Morell and Erwin Giesing reported no such abnormality, and Hitler often refused full medical examinations, adding to the uncertainty. His childhood doctor, Austrian Jew Eduard Bloch, even told American interrogators in 1943 that Hitler's genitals were completely normal. The Soviets later claimed that their 1945 autopsy confirmed the myth, but this report is unreliable. Hitler's body was burned almost completely, making it impossible to confirm. The rumor, rooted in propaganda and humor to mock the masculinity of the Nazi leadership, endures more as cultural folklore. Nazi soap. The idea that Nazis mass-produced soap from human fat dates back to World War I, when British propaganda accused Germany of running a corpse factory to make soap and glycerin from soldiers' bodies. The rumor resurfaced in World War II with Soviet reports, camp testimonies, and Allied media spreading the claim as evidence of Nazi barbarism. However, no proof exists of mass soap production from human fat in concentration camps. Holocaust museums and historians have clarified that the widely cited RIF soap bars were industrial products, misread as reines Judenfett, pure Jewish fat, when in fact they stood for Reichsstelle für industrielle Fettversorgung, a state agency for industrial fat supply. At the Danzig Anatomical Institute, Dr. Rudolf Spanner conducted experiments during World War II using human cadavers, primarily for anatomical research. These produced a soap soap-like byproduct from body fat used in small quantities for cleaning tools. Polish and German historians confirmed this was limited, experimental, and not intended for mass production or hygiene. The process was misconstrued as soap making due to wartime rumors and Soviet reports fueling the myth. The Hitler was partly Jewish myth. Rumors that Hitler had Jewish ancestry began in the 1920s, used by political opponents to undermine the credibility of his anti-Semitism. The Nazis dismissed the claims as smears, but Hitler himself was deeply insecure about his background and ordered investigations. The speculation centers on his father, Alois Hitler, who was illegitimate. The mother of Alois, Maria Schicklgruber, worked as a servant in Graz in the 1830s and became pregnant while employed in the household of a wealthy Jewish businessman, Leopold Frankenberger. Some later claimed Frankenberger was the father. Alois eventually took the surname Hitler after convincing the authorities to name Johann Georg Hiedler as his father. His biological father remains unknown though. The story resurfaced in 1938 when Hitler's British nephew, William Patrick Hitler, attempted to blackmail him, leading Adolf Hitler to ask lawyer Hans Frank to investigate. Frank later alleged that Frankenberger paid child support to Maria Schicklgruber, though historians dismissed this as unreliable speculation. Heinrich Himmler also pursued inquiries into Hitler's ancestry as late as 1944, feeding the rumor. Hitler himself seemed obsessed with hiding his family past. He destroyed family records and repeatedly suggested in Mein Kampf that Jewish men preyed on Aryan women, echoing his own fears about his grandma. The 1935 Nuremberg laws even forbade Aryan women under 45 from working in Jewish households. In 2010, Belgian researchers collected saliva samples from Hitler's living relatives, including his great-nephew Alexander Stuart Houston, and suggested possible distant North African or Jewish ancestry. Still, no direct evidence proves that Hitler had Jewish grandparents, and the claim remains unresolved and unlikely. The racist Nazis myth. Allied anti-German propaganda often portrayed the National Socialists as universally racist, hating all non-Germans. But National Socialist racial ideology was centered on preserving a homogeneous German state, not on blanket hatred of other peoples. They emphasized what they called pro-German racialism, the idea that Germans should defend and improve themselves while other nations should do the same. Allied propaganda twisted this into an anti-other race ideology. In fact, the German army included foreign volunteers from Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China, India, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and many other countries. Germany also formed pragmatic alliances with Japan, cultivated ties in the Arab world, and Hitler expressed admiration for Gandhi's anti-colonialism. Although Germany wanted to keep Germany German, visiting people of other races were welcome. They even condemned US lynchings of African Americans, calling them Wild West violence, to score political points during 1930s US boycotts of Nazi Germany. That said, the Nazis were not free of racism. Their ideology was built on anti-Semitism, hostility to Slavic peoples, and a belief in German superiority. Yet, the idea that they applied this hostility to all races equally is misleading. The policies of eugenics in Nazi Germany were based on genetics and racial ideology, aiming to biologically improve the German people through selective breeding of so-called Nordic or Aryan traits. These policies justified involuntary sterilization and the persecution of those deemed undesirable. However, eugenics did not begin in Nazi Germany. It was a global movement long before Hitler, with programs in the US, Britain, and elsewhere. The Rockefeller Foundation and other institutions promoted sterilization and racial science in the early 20th century. By 1945, about 60,000 people had been forcibly sterilized in the US, especially in California. The Nazi sterilization law of 1933 directly mirrored American models. After the war, Allied countries downplayed their own role, framing eugenics as a uniquely Nazi crime. The Nazis were anti-Christian myth. Allied propaganda like US films such as Why We Fight portrayed Nazis as uniformly anti-Christian to rally religious support and paint them as godless heathens. However, Germany under Hitler was a predominantly Christian nation, and many new churches were built during his rule. Hitler himself promoted positive Christianity and visited church. Leading Nazis often saw themselves within a Christian framework, even if their interpretations varied. Figures like Martin Bormann, Alfred Rosenberg and Heinrich Himmler were hostile to the churches, with Himmler and some SS followers favoring a return to Germanic pagan roots. Others, such as Hans Kerrel, the Minister of Church Affairs, advocated positive Christianity, a Nazi-altered form that rejected Christianity's Jewish origins and redefined Jesus as an Aryan, leading a struggle against Jews. The Nazis sought to align Christianity with their racial worldview, supporting it in public but clashing with clergy who resisted. Groups like the Confessing Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, and sections of the Catholic clergy opposed the regime and faced persecution. Jehovah's Witnesses in particular were sent to concentration camps, while Christians of Jewish descent were targeted as part of racial laws. The Nazi regime also banned astrologers, healers, fortune tellers, and witchcraft. Relations with the Catholic Church were tense, since the Pope denounced the party as anti-Catholic. Some scholars argue that Nazi leaders ultimately intended to eradicate Christianity, while others find no evidence of such plans. The Nazis burned all books myth stemmed from Allied media, like US newsreels, that tried to paint Germans as anti-intellectual. The Nazis did not destroy every book in Germany. The well-known book burning took place on May 10, 1933, when the German Student Union organized a one-time symbolic event targeting works labeled degenerate or un-German. Books by authors such as Marx, Freud, Einstein, and others associated with Jewish identity, socialism, communism, liberalism, anarchism, or sexology were singled out, along with anything that clashed with NS ideology. The action was meant as propaganda rather than an attempt to wipe out all literature, and approved works remained untouched. The gay Nazis myth claims that homosexuals were numerous or influential within the Nazi party. While some gay men did join, there is no evidence they were overrepresented. The myth began in the 1920s when left-wing opponents of the Nazis used homosexuality as a smear campaign. The SPD and KPD, who opposed Germany's anti-gay law, still used homosexuality to attack their Nazi rivals. They mocked Nazi leaders like Ernst Röhm, who was openly homosexual. In 1931, the SPD exposed Röhm's sexuality in an attempt to block Nazi power. Rumors about other leaders, including Rudolf Hess and even Hitler himself, also circulated in exile opposition media. Hitler later exaggerated homosexuality within the Sturmabteilung to justify the Night of the Long Knives purge in 1934, which eliminated Röhm and much of the SA leadership. In practice, the Nazis condemned and persecuted homosexuality, jailing thousands of gay men. The myth persisted after the war, promoted by Allied propaganda, but historians agree it has no basis. The Blitzkrieg myth. Although widely used in journalism during World War II, Blitzkrieg was never an official German military strategy. It existed mainly as a propaganda and media label. The myth of a unique German lightning war doctrine arose because journalists and Allied leaders used it to explain early German victories in Poland and France. Hitler himself used the word in 1935 for political effect, but within the Wehrmacht, it wasn't recognized as a concept. German success came from effective combined arms operations, integrating infantry, tanks, and air power to exploit weaknesses. German operations were adaptive and situational rather than based on a fixed Blitzkrieg plan. The term persisted because it provided a simple narrative of German superiority while also offering the Allies an alibi for their own failures. The stab in the back myth, or Dolchstoßlegende, was a theory in post-World War I Germany, claiming the army was undefeated in the field but betrayed by disloyal civilians at home, particularly Jews, Republicans, Socialists, and Communists. Politicians who signed the 1918 armistice and toppled the monarchy were condemned as November criminals. The idea was promoted by military leaders like General Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who used it to deflect blame from their own failures. Hindenburg spread it further in 1919 by testifying before a parliamentary inquiry that the army had not truly been defeated. The myth alleged that Marxist trade union leaders ordered strikes and civil unrest, which deprived German troops of vital supplies, leading to collapse. The National Socialists seized on this narrative, making it central to their propaganda. It fueled anti-Semitism and anti-communism, portrayed the Weimar Republic as weak and illegitimate, and justified calls for extreme nationalism and a strong authoritarian leader who could undo the betrayal and restore national honor. The Allies indirectly reinforced the legend by blaming Germany solely for the war in the Treaty of Versailles, which fed resentment and gave credibility to the claim. Economic collapse during the Great Depression amplified resentment, boosting Nazi use of the myth. The Nazis' plan to enslave all peoples myth was pushed once again by Allied propaganda like US films, portraying them as bent on universal subjugation. This exaggerated narrative rallied support by depicting Nazis as uniquely barbaric. In reality, Nazi plans were brutal but selective. The Holocaust targeted Jews, and Generalplan Ost aimed to displace or enslave millions of Slavs in Eastern Europe for living space. Forced labor programs exploited 7 million foreign workers by 1944, but these were driven by war needs, not a universal slavery blueprint. Pragmatic alliances with Japan and Arab leaders underscore this. Also, Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians were marked for future assimilation through Germanization, not enslavement. The Allies amplified this myth to justify total war, downplaying their own colonial labor practices.